conversation has been an insight as to just how far and wide this crisis has spread. And I don't need to tell any of you because you're living it. But I appreciate sincerely the time that you've allotted, and we're going to protect your important time allocation by getting to the substance of today's schedule. There are some introductions that need to be made, and they're important today. While this virtual format is cumbersome, it does allow us to continue to conduct the important business of our work. Until we can meet in person again, thanks to each of you for your patience and your flexibility. And as we continue to adjust to this format, it's constantly evolving. I've still got a lot to learn, but your patience is appreciated. If you have any technical difficulties during the meeting, you can email Michelle, you can raise your hand, you can use the chat function, but please don't suffer in silence. Let's try to address it. There are some quick reminders that I need to cover. The public is participating by Judicial Branch YouTube channel. It doesn't allow for those folks that are in our viewing to exchange dialogue. So if any questions need to be directed to anyone other than staff or to fellow commissioners, staff will follow up after the meeting and share responses in a subsequent email. For any member, and I appreciate pretty unanimous compliance here. Chief King, I want to see your smiling toothy grin. For any of my commissioners that are not sharing video, I'll accept that. But if you're not, you need to announce yourself before speaking. If you are sharing video, you don't need to announce yourself before speaking. To be recognized for a question or comment, please use the chat feature in the Webex down in my desktop monitor. It's the lower right-hand corner. To send a message to everyone, but you can also send private messages to the host, which would be Michelle. Or you can use this e-hand in the Webex that will also get our attention. Or for those of you that are sharing video, do it the old school way. For a motion, please make sure that you are unmuted. I still am a culprit of that technical challenge. So please make an effort to unmute yourself before you state your motion. And any votes are going to have to be conducted by a roll call. I'll state the motion and who makes the motion, and Michelle will call the names. We only anticipate one vote today, anticipate being emphasized, and that will be approval of the minutes. So just again, standard quick reminder, housekeeping mention here is that we do have other meeting dates scheduled. Right now, it'd just be speculative for me to tell you whether it will be in this WebEx format or other, but those dates are published, and they are March the 5th, June the 4th, September the 10th, and December the 3rd. Please mark your calendars. Now, I'm going to surrender to my trusted ally in this convening, our executive director, Michelle, who's going to go over another update and tutorial about WebEx. Michelle, it's all yours.
Good morning. I will try and do this quickly. WebEx has not been our friend in the sense that they keep updating their features. So I am going to quickly run through a few reminders. Let me just share the screen real quick of some of the key features for WebEx and one new one. So are you all seeing my screen at this point? There we go. Okay, so just as a quick reminder, this is sort of what your meeting screen looks like with videos populated. At the bottom, these are the options for your audio and your video, and then the red X for when you leave the meeting. In the bottom right hand, you can click on the participant list to see everybody, and that's also where you can access the chat feature. You can also use that to message everybody or to message an individual or the host by just typing in that box. In the participant list, this is where you can see everybody. It's also where if you hover over your own name, you can use this little hand feature to raise your hand, and that will alert the host that you have a question. This little box at the top, sort of in the top right meeting corner, is how you can change the view. Judge Brown has been referring to the grid view or Brady Bunch view. That's the one with the 4 squares. But if you want an alternative view, there's several options there. During the presentations, if you want to zoom in or zoom out, you can use these magnifying glasses, which will appear on your screen if you hover on the left side during a presentation if you needed to zoom in on something. The newest feature that Webex has released is relating to muting and unmuting. So at times we have to mute due to feedback, and I can't automatically unmute anybody anymore, which is kind of cumbersome. So instead, I will send you a request to unmute yourself, and this box will appear on your screen. So if you want to be unmuted, then you just click the unmute me. Otherwise, you can just stay muted. But with that, I will turn it back over to Judge Brown for the minutes.
At this point, I will. We're going to do a combo minutes motion, and the roll call necessary for acting on our minutes will also be our attendance roll call. So I will entertain a motion regarding the minutes that you received in advance of the convening.
So moved, they be approved.
Second.
All right, I acknowledge Luther Moore as the commissioner that made the motion, and I heard 2 voices and didn't catch the illuminated screen. Who made the second?
Amy Lee.
It's a duel. All right, Commissioner Lee, it's going to be recorded that you were motions be approved as drafted. So at this point, Michelle will do a roll call. Will please
I apologize. There's a lot of audio feedback, so I had to mute everybody. So I'm going to call the roll, so please make sure that you are unmuted to respond. And I'm going to check everybody's name as you respond to when I call out your name. And if I don't check your name, that's an indication that, and you are present, that's an indication that we cannot hear you. I apologize. I'm going to mute everybody again because there's a lot of feedback. Okay. Judge Charlie Brown.
I am Charlie Brown. I am present. I am the chairman of the Sentencing Commission, and I am the appointee of the Chief Justice. I vote in favor of the minutes as presented.
Francis Battle. Art Beeler.
Aye.
Sheriff Clemens. Senator Daniel.
Sheriff Clemens, aye.
Oh, thank you, Sheriff. Senator Daniel. Louise Davis. Danielle Elder.
Aye.
Judge Elliott.
Aye.
Representative Faircloth. Senator Fitch.
Aye.
Chairman Fowler. Lindsay Granato. Judge Horn.
Aye.
Susan Katzenelson. Chief King.
Aye.
Maureen Kruger. Tammy Lee.
Aye.
Dr. McMurray.
Aye.
Representative McNeil.
Aye.
Clerk Mixon. Luther Moore.
Aye.
Secretary Moose.
Aye.
Judge Morrison.
Aye.
Representative Richardson. Senator Steinberg. Mr. Suber. Patrick Weed.
Aye.
Judge Zachary.
Aye.
Roll call complete.
Thank you, Michelle. This audio thing is a real challenge, you guys. Michelle's multitasking when she's trying to show you who's she's heard, but also check in with muting those of us that are, I'll use the word guilty, but it's not meant as anything to suggest that you're the problem of getting the feedback. So if she mutes me again, I expect her to let go, because that's going to need to happen sometimes. Also, when she's sharing her screen, for those of you, if you're on handhelds, then it's very limited functionality anyway. But when any presenter is sharing a screen, you have minimal layout opportunities because they kind of seize control of what you're looking at. But it's at this time that I have the pleasure of recognizing a long-serving and very valued commissioner. So, normally this would give me the opportunity to stand in acknowledgement, to read this resolution. I do have my pants on, but I'm not going to stand. I am going to address outgoing Commissioner Chris Fialco with the following. Whereas the duty of North Carolina Sentencing and Policy Advisory Commission is to evaluate sentencing laws and policies and to recommend modifications to the General Assembly, and whereas Mr. Chris Fialco was appointed to the North Carolina Sentencing and Policy Advisory Commission on July 5th, 2011 to represent the North Carolina Advocates for Justice, and whereas Mr. Fialco participated as a member of the Classification of Homicide and Drug Offenses Subcommittee, the Credit for Time Served Subcommittee, Legislative Review Subcommittee, a standing subcommittee, and DWI Sentencing Subcommittee. And now, therefore, be it resolved that the North Carolina Sentencing and Policy Advisory Commission recognizes the service which Mr. Fialco rendered as a member of the commission, and be it further resolved that the North Carolina Sentencing and Policy Advisory Commission expresses appreciation to Mr. Fialco for his commitment of time and effort. Be it further resolved that the members of the North Carolina Sentencing and Policy Advisory Commission wish Mr. Fialco well and welcome him to any convening of the North Carolina Sentencing and Policy Advisory Commission. This, the 4th day of December, 2020. I will entertain a motion.
Move the resolution be approved.
Second by McNeil.
There has been a motion and a second that the resolution as read be adopted. I'm going to entertain a voice vote, anonymous voice vote, And seeing that everyone unanimously voted in favor of this resolution, it is passed and be made a part of minutes. So at this point, with that formality, that honorary recognition having been presented, I want to recognize Mr. Fialco, who has joined us today, and invite him to say anything that he would like to the commission and staff.
Okay, thank you very much. I just wanted to say three things. One is, when I was reflecting on 9 years of being on the commission, I was just struck by how nonpartisan it has always been, especially striking this year when everything seems to have been so damn partisan. The second was, I just learned so much every meeting, whether it was a board meeting or subcommittee meeting, that I do think I got more out of it than I put in. And the third is, if it's all right, Judge Brown, I'm going to tell a short story about Judge Spainhour, if I could. It turns out you said that I was appointed in July, so my first meeting ever was in September of 2011. And it just so happens that I was in a homicide trial with Judge Spainhour in Asheville that week in September. It was actually an Innocence Inquiry Commission 3-judge panel. And we started on Monday. We had the burden of proof, so I was putting on witness after witness and fully expected us to go through Friday and into the next week. And on Thursday afternoon, Judge Spainhour said, "We're not coming tomorrow. We have a sentencing commission meeting." And then he looked over at me and said, "And Mr. Fialco, I expect you to be there at 10 o'clock sharp." So I got up at 5 in the morning in Nashville and drove so that I was there because I was afraid of Judge Spainhour. I really miss that guy. So anyway, thank you. It's been my great honor to serve on the commission. Thank you very much.
Thank you for sharing that memory, Chris. Yes. So at this time, I'll make the following comment that's a important circumstance that Commissioner Secretary Tim Moose shared with us before today's meeting. Many of you remember Gwen Norval. She's a friend to the commission. She was a partner in important work up until her untimely death 3 years ago. Gwen helped start the Bertie Public Safety Cadets Program as a way for youth. I see you, Commissioner Lee. For youth to enter the criminal justice profession. She wanted to share and appreciate, we wanted to share and appreciate Secretary Moose sending on this information about this scholarship. It's a scholarship that's been set up at Martin Community College. And it's the Gwen F. Norval Scholarship Award for all future Bertie Public Safety Cadets. Michelle's going to circulate the information to the commission after the meeting, and it's certainly a wonderful way, Secretary Moose, to honor Gwen's memory, a legacy, and particularly her passion for criminal justice. I knew my fellow commissioners would love to hear that update about our friend, Gwen Norval, and her memory. I see you, Representative McNeil. So at this time, it's my honor to read a resolution. And it's titled, "A Resolution Honoring the Service and Memory of Judge W. Irwin Spainhour." The Honorable W. Irwin Spainhour passed away at the age of 77 on September 26, 2020. He is survived by his wife, Jane, and children, Andrew, Elizabeth, and John. Judge Spainhour served on the North Carolina Sentencing Policy Advisory Commission beginning in 1998, representing the Conference of Superior Court Judges. He was appointed chair of the commission in 1999. As a testament to the confidence placed in him in that role, Judge Spainhour was reappointed 8 times by 4 different Chief Justices of the North Carolina Supreme Court. Judge Spainhour led the commission with steady and diligent leadership for nearly 18 years, from 1999 to 2017. During that time, he guided the commission through making revisions to structured sentencing in response to projected prison overcrowding and to United States Supreme Court case, as well as studying a number of issues pursuant to legislative requests. His efforts resulted in great benefit to not only the criminal justice system, but to North Carolina as a whole. After serving in the United States Army, Judge Spainhour finished law school at the University of North Carolina School of Law and moved to Concord, where he spent 27 years in private practice until 1997, when Governor James B. Hunt appointed him to the Superior Court bench. Judge Spainhour served as senior resident Superior Court judge for Judicial District 19A until his retirement in 2014, after which he continued to serve as an emergency judge and as a certified mediator. Judge Spainhour was deeply invested in the work of the commission and committed to the principles of structured sentencing. He led with patience, humor, and will be remembered for his unwavering loyalty and appreciation for fellow commissioners and the staff. He had a perfect record for starting every meeting precisely at 10 a.m. in accordance with the quote Army way. And I was afraid of him too, Mr. Fialco. And he affectionately referred to the Sentencing Commission staff as, and this is a direct quote, and it's etched in my memory because he never failed to declare it at every convening, subcommittee, full commission, regardless. And that quote is, "We, commissioners, benefit from the best staff in state government." In addition to his work with the Sentencing Commission, Judge Spainhour served as president of the North Carolina Conference of Superior Court Judges. He's a member of the North Carolina Board of Law Examiners and president of the North Carolina State Bar. He was awarded the Order of the Longleaf Pine upon his retirement in 2014 and the Friend of the Court Award in 2017. Now, therefore, be it resolved that his untimely death leaves the commission, the justice system, and community to grieve for the loss of a kind, dedicated, and exceptional public servant. Be it further resolved that a copy of this resolution be spread upon the minutes of this meeting with a copy to his beloved widow and children to preserve for future remembrances of the contributions he made to the North Carolina Sentencing and Policy Advisory Commission and to the state of North Carolina. This, the 4th day of December, 2020.
Move the adoption of the resolution.
Second, Mark.
Thank you. There's been a motion and a second. I will accept a anonymous voice vote and will conclude a unanimous acceptance of that resolution. Thank you to the staff and my fellow commissioners for that honor and recognition to the service and memory of Judge Spainhour. So we have some plans, you guys. Michelle and staff have put together some ideas, and we've come to an agreement on moving forward to further honor Judge Spainhour. Michelle is now taking control of your computer. She's sharing her screen. She's loaded this slide, and let me cover it with you. We have some plans for our boardroom because we won't be doing this Webex forever. And we will have installed an engraved frame, similar to the frame we had designed for the 25th anniversary celebration. You can see the picture here on the slide. In that frame will be a photo and a copy of the resolution that we just passed. We're also going to hang a clock next to it in recognition of the importance of today's resolution and the importance of time in the commission's work. The importance of time to Judge Spainhour and his presiding as chair over the commission. The importance of time, symbolic to the Army way, the work of the commission, and to Judge Spainhour's professionalism. And for that reason, we thought the clock was an appropriate symbol to honor Judge Spainhour. Michelle, we have some unidentified call-in users. We were hopeful that Jane Spainhour was going to be able to join us. Can you tell me whether she is on the line?
She is on the line.
Let me welcome Jane Spainhour. And Jane, thank you for joining us. I would like to recognize you. It's an honor to have you join us today. We're going to send the original copy of the past resolution to you. On behalf of all current and former commissioners and staff, we want to thank you for your support of Judge Spainhour's chairmanship and the commission itself for so many years. We want to express our deepest sympathy for your loss. We appreciate you joining us and want to give you the opportunity to say a few words if you'd like. I'm looking at the participant role there, Michelle, and I don't see anybody that has just unmuted themselves. Are you seeing the same thing as me?
I can't see the full list because I'm sharing, but I would look to Ginny or Shelley if you could help and see if we can identify which line is Mrs. Spainhour's and unmute that if possible. Judge Brown, if it's okay with you, I'm going to unmute all the call-in users and see if that would work.
Which is going to require them to then unmute themselves, as you explained in our new Webex feature. So, Ms. Spainhour, if you're able to hear me, there are some technical requirements, and while you're not being muted by the host, you'll have to unmute yourself if you would like to say a few things. All right. Thank you, Michelle, for coordinating this remembrance of Judge Spainhour. So at this time, we will review the agenda, and it's the agenda. Of course, you got it short and sweet, and but substantive. And what I, in recognition of the time, would like to do is I'm going to switch gears really quick and not delete anything, but I think it does merit putting some emphasis here on the ongoing study that we are doing on sentencing practices. And so we will reserve some time to talk about the task force, the governor's task force on racial equity. And we have presenters that are prepared to comment on that. And I'll talk about the survey as time allows, but I don't want to rob the staff of the presentation time on our study and the progress we've made and some of its features. So with that amendment to the agenda, I'll just at this point say that the presentations will include both Becky Whitaker and Megan Boyd. Jennifer Lutz is going to present on some key findings from the literature on sentencing practice disparity. And also Michelle's going to wrap it up with some of our statewide sentencing data. So I'm looking forward to this update and presentation. We've reserved more than an hour to do this, which includes some discussion time. And so we will launch into that. Michelle, at this time, I'm going to recognize Becky. Is that right first?
That's correct.
All right. So Becky, if you'll begin as our first presenter on the North Carolina Sentencing Policy Advisory Commission's own study on sentencing practices, the updates on the progress, and we look forward to your presentation.
Good morning.
Good morning.
All right, I'm going to share something as well. Let's see if we can get that going. Apologies, I have a guest. I'm sure you can hear her. Here we go. Okay, so in preparation for our own disparity report, we wanted to take a look at what other states are doing around the issue of disparity. We asked ourselves a few questions. Have other states and the federal government examined disparity issues in the criminal justice system? And if so, what issues did they examine and how did they look at them? And then what did they find? The purpose for us wanting to do this was so that we could have a better understanding ourselves of the landscape of disparity reports, and then also just to provide context for our own report. Because this area has the potential to be so broad, we did limit the scope of our research, and we looked at published government reports on disparity, both adult and juvenile, in all 50 states and the federal government. As I mentioned, the scope of our research excluded any reports from academia or research entities unless they were specifically enlisted by a governmental agency. And you can see that we ended up with 107 total reports from 42 states and the federal government. If you look at the map that you have on the screen, the dark blue represents states that have published both adult and juvenile disparity reports. The green represents states that have only produced adult disparity reports, and the orange represents states that have only published juvenile disparity reports. The brighter blue represents the 8 states where we could not find any disparity reports from those states. So you can see that nearly 3/4 of the reports that we found were on the adult system. And just a note about juvenile reports, most of these reports were published pursuant to the Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention Act.
federal legislation which requires states to report on disproportionate minority contact in their juvenile justice system in order to receive federal grant funding. Failure to comply with that can result in loss of that federal grant funding, which is the reason that many of these states do these reports. And for that reason, we are going to be primarily covering adult reports in this presentation. And for comparison purposes, we also looked at what has previously been reported in North Carolina. We found 6 reports on the adult system and 2 reports on the juvenile system here in North Carolina. And the examples we found in the adult system were our own Sentencing Commission's Sentencing Practices Disparity Report from 2002. We found a report from Halifax County in conjunction with the North Carolina Commission on Racial and Ethnic Disparities on disparity in bond setting. And then we also found a couple of reports on traffic stops, one by the Governor's Crime Commission and one that was a report to the federal government. As for the juvenile reports in North Carolina, we have also been in compliance with the federal statute, and those were reports on disproportionate minority contact that were tied to that federal funding. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Megan, and she is going to go into a little more detail about these adult disparity reports.
Okay, thank you so much, Becky. I'm just going to ask for control of the presentation so that I can move through the slides. Okay, yes, as Becky mentioned, I'm going to go into the actual information we were able to find on these adult disparity reports. I'm going to discuss some of the characteristics that we noticed throughout the reports, and that's things like geography, whether it was a guideline state, when the report was actually published, if it was mandated by a government entity, whether or not which entity actually published the report, the research design, and of course the topic, which is arguably the most important. And these following slides will primarily focus on what other states have been doing. Sorry, it looks like there's a little bit of a delay moving through the slides. I may just ask if Becky wouldn't mind advancing the slides for me. Apologies for the technical difficulties. Oh, okay, great, thank you. Okay, so on this first slide here, I'm going to go over geography and the guideline status. If you look at the map on the right, this represents all of the states that have published adult disparity reports. And we found from the 76 reports, we found 35 states. Now, the 2 colors that you're seeing actually delineates for those states who've published reports, which states were guideline states, and that's in the dark, the green, and the dark blue represents which were non-guideline states. And overall, we noted that Washington and the federal government actually were the entities, and by Washington, I do mean Washington State, were the entities that produced the largest number of reports. They actually both produced 7 reports each. And in terms of the total trends, we noticed that states with guidelines produced more of the reports than non-guideline states. And in fact, in total, that was 14 states who were designated as guidelines, and they produced 42 of the total reports. So that's 42 out of 76 reports. Becky, if you could, next slide. Okay, and in terms of the timeline when these reports were published, this graphic here shows that we were able to gather reports starting in 1993 and then going all the way up through 2020. There was one report that was published in 1979 that we actually found from the state of Alaska, but that's a bit of an outlier, so we excluded it from the graphic here. But what this really represents is that over this time period that we looked at, almost 60% of the reports were published since 2010. And in fact, if you can see that nice little spike that happens towards the end of the chart, in 2016, there was an overall increase in the number of publications. And in fact, the years that had the largest number of publications was in fact 2018, 2019. And interestingly, despite what we have going on with COVID and whatnot, and the fact that we stopped collecting these reports as of September because we had to choose some cutoff date, there was still 5 reports that were published in 2020 that we were able to find. Next slide. Now, looking at the mandate and publishing entity, we found some interesting information as well. And by mandate, we mean just as our General Assembly asked us to do certain reports, like our JR report annually, we were interested to see how many of these reports were requested by a government entity. And we found 42 of the 76 reports were actually mandated. In terms of the different entities that mandated the report, the majority of them were required from the legislature, which is probably not unexpected. And in the time frame that they were asked to do, only about half of the mandated reports were one-time reports. So we weren't really seeing as many reports that were required on an annual or a biannual basis. Now on the right-hand side, you'll see this pie chart, which represents the publishing entities, which is slightly different than who mandated. This is actually who did the work, who wrote up the report, and published the eventual report. And here, the largest number of reports actually came from the judicial branch. They had 25 reports with 33% of the total. And the next largest categories were independent commissions with 16 reports and the executive branch with 15 reports. Next slide. Okay. Here we have our research design, or essentially methodologies that were used in these reports. We assessed all 76 of the reports, and we were able to record 158 unique instances of methodology use. And by that, we mean an individual report may have used one or more types of methodology in their report, and so that's why there's more uses of methodology than the actual number of reports. And you can see well and above, descriptive statistics and regression analysis were the report types that were most commonly used. And in fact, it represents, just descriptive statistics represents a full third of the methodologies that we were able to collect. And only 6 states did not use some form of descriptive statistics. Next slide. Now, kind of the most important issue that we wanted to assess was, what were these reports about? And we were able to categorize them into 6 broad categories. And we've called them stops, pre-sentence, sentencing, capital punishment, multiple points, and other. Just a quick note for multiple points. What we mean there is that they were looking at different time points throughout the process. So it could have been on arrest, prosecution, and sentencing. The other categories were discrete, looking at just sentencing or just stops. As you can see from the pie chart, looking at the orange and that yellow color, the largest categories that we found were in fact sentencing reports at 37% and those multiple points reports with a total of 34. The next largest categories that we found were really primarily just the stop reports. And in looking at those, we were able to find 12 publications. Next slide. Okay, now, having looked at all these charts and data and figures, what are the key takeaways that we found from these report characteristics? Looking at it regionally, we noted that the states in the South tended to publish fewer reports than other regions. But when we compare that to how North Carolina performed, North Carolina actually ranks among the most well-published states. So for instance, Washington and Alaska published 7 and 6 reports respectively. And we had, on our own, for our adult reports, we had 6 reports. And so that shows that North Carolina is actually ranking among the most published states. And looking at guideline status, we did note that guideline states tended to publish more reports than non-guideline states. And again, North Carolina followed this trend of guideline states, specifically in publishing a report on sentencing disparity. And an interesting sort of distinction that we saw there, guideline states did tend to publish more sentencing in multiple points, and non-guideline states tended to put out more reports on stop and arrest. Over time, the reports have increased, especially in this last decade. And even in the last decade, we've noticed that there's certain topics that have emerged as more publications than previous topics. So stop reports have really increased in the last decade, whereas sentencing and multiple points, those were more consistently studied over time. And in fact, both of the sentencing and multiple points tended to lead each decade in the 90s and the 2000s as the most common report type. In terms of descriptive statistics and the regression analysis, again, those were the most common methodologies. And I would like to emphasize this because it sort of confirms for us our usage of both of these types of methodologies in both our 2002 report as well as our new 2020 report that we are working on now, that Michelle will share some preliminary information with you on. And finally, the sentencing reports were the most frequent topic type. The most infrequent topic type was pre-sentence reports. And just a note about what that means, pre-sentence, we had only 2 reports we were able to find. One was a pretrial report and the other was a pre-sentence investigation report. And with that, I think I'm going to let Becky take back over, and she's going to go into a little bit more detail on the adult disparity reports that just dealt with sentencing.
Thank you, Megan. Yes, so we're going to zoom in from Megan's overview of all of the adult reports that we found and focus on those that specifically dealt with sentencing. As Megan said, sentencing is the most common report topic, and the next largest category was reports studying multiple points in the criminal justice process. So this chart that you can see here represents all 76 of the adult reports that we found. And you can see that sentencing is discussed in more than 2/3 of those 76 reports. 28 of the reports analyzed multiple points in the criminal justice process, and it's important to note that of those 26, only 3 of them did not mention sentencing. So the reports on multiple points overwhelmingly did also include an analysis of sentencing. As for the characteristics of these sentencing reports, we can see that 13 states and the federal government published sentencing reports. As for volume of reports, the Midwest and the West published the most reports on sentencing. And states with sentencing guidelines produced more reports than non-guideline states. And these characteristics of these sentencing reports are similar to the ones that Megan described for all of the adult reports. Half of them have been published in the last decade, but the earliest sentencing report was published in Alaska in 1979. More than half of these reports were government mandated, mostly by state legislatures or the federal government. And as for who was publishing these reports, the 3 most common publishing entities were state judicial branches and independent commissions and the federal government. These reports also tended to utilize descriptive statistics and regression analysis as the most common methodologies, as Megan noted, for the entire set of adult reports. So at this point, you might be asking, well, what did these reports find about sentencing? And so some considerations to keep in mind when comparing these studies. It's important to remember that the studies differ based on the different states and their different legal systems, the data availability, the focus of the study, and other things of that nature. So I wouldn't say that we're comparing apples to oranges, but I might say that we are comparing different types of apples. So maybe we're comparing Honeycrisp to Granny Smith to Red Delicious, if you kind of get that analogy. But the goal here is really to point out the themes and commonalities that we found among these sentencing reports. So most of these reports used race as a primary focus of the study. However, some of them also went further and looked at ethnicity, age, and gender as other factors to consider. Most of the reports utilize statewide level data, but we did come across a few that were only looking at a specific municipality or county. Most of the reports used felonies as a whole, but some of them did focus on specific offenses. So we saw, for example, a report that only analyzed disparity in drug offenses. Most of these reports use legal factors. Example would be prior record level or offense classification as control variables. But again, some of the reports went a little bit further and actually controlled for extralegal factors as well, such as an example of that would be they looked at the breakdown between urban and rural areas to see how the data differed in those areas. And most reports looked at sentence type, so the in-out decision. In other words, whether a person was sentenced to an active sentence or to a non-active sentence, and then also the sentence length. But we did see some that analyzed things like sentencing enhancements or mitigating and aggravating factors. And then a word about the terminology that was used in these reports. Most of them did use the words either disparity or disproportionality as terminology, but there is quite a bit of nuance there. So even if they're using the same word, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're making the exact same kind of analysis. Most often when the words disparity or disproportionality were used, they were being used to refer to a situation where there was a statistically significant difference between a minority group's representation in the general population of the state and their representation in the sentenced population. But, you know, we did see one report that kind of had a term of art. So they were referring to things as evidence of systemic bias rather than using disparity or disproportionality. So taking these reports as a whole, these sentencing reports as a whole, most of them found that there was some level of disparity based on race, either in the sentence type, that is whether the person was sentenced to an active or non-active sentence, or in the sentence length and severity. But a small number, only 4 of the reports, either didn't find disparity in sentencing or their results were inconclusive. However, we are not done with this, and we are continuing to examine the findings from these reports. And so, you know, stay tuned. There may be more to come on this, particularly in the report that we end up publishing. There may be more information from this particular area.
Thank you, Becky. And at this time, we're going to turn to some key findings from the literature as staff has prepared to update us on the progress being made. And I'm going to recognize staff member Jennifer Lutz.
Good morning, everyone. I'm going to share my screen here. Give me a moment. Give me one more moment. Doesn't seem to be wanting to cooperate. All right. So now that we've heard about the existing disparity studies from other state agencies, what I'm going to review is the key findings from academic literature. And so the review of the academic literature is really important because it's going to offer some different insights. As academic literature is often theory-driven, it's not going to be mandated by a legislative mandate. It's going to provide information on statistical techniques. And it's also going to point out some of the key variables, both independent and dependent variables, that we should be considering in our own study. Further, these academic studies are going to provide the groundwork for understanding the Commission's own results. And so Becky started to hit on this a little bit and understanding what is a disparity. And just like state agencies, there's really not an agreed upon definition of sentencing disparity among the academic community. So some define sentencing disparities as the proportion of a group within the criminal justice system being greater than the proportion of that group in the general population. And so that's what I have exemplified here in this graphic. So for example, Blacks make up about 12% of the US adult population, but they make up 33% of the US prison population. Similarly, Hispanics make about 16% of the US adult population, but make up 23% of the US prison population. On the other hand, others define sentencing disparities as a departure from the normative standard that's been set by the court. So while similarly situated crimes and offenders with similar criminal histories should be receiving the same exact sentence, when courts kind of depart from these standards based on a non-legal factor, that would be defined as a sentencing disparity. So with that said, when we're considering our own study, we'll have to be very clear for the purposes of our research how we're defining a sentencing disparity. So as we know, but it's important to remind ourselves, there are several discrete decision points prior to an offender ever reaching the sentencing stage. So these decision points, whether they be in the criminal justice process as a whole or within the court processing stages, have a potential for a disparity to occur. So it's important to note that we're only capturing one part of this, and there could be a number of disparities that have happened before an individual ever reaches the sentencing stage. And so we can't really capture what's happening prior to that. So these include things like policing practices, policing decisions, the jury selection process, the school to prison pipeline, bail, pretrial detention. All of those are going to influence what happens and who ends up at the sentencing stage. However, in the academic literature, these are kind of the typical points that are studied. The first being things like charge reduction. So maybe a reduction from a felony charge to a misdemeanor conviction, or a more serious charge to a lesser conviction, discretionary sentencing decisions like downward departures, an application of a sentencing enhancement. And probably the two most studied decision points are the in-out decisions, whether someone receives an active sentence, and when someone receives an active sentence, what is that sentence length? And so legal factors like offense severity, offense type, criminal history are usually strong and significant predictors of sentencing outcomes. Previous sentencing research also suggests that non-legal factors, or what we call extralegal factors, like race and ethnicity, sex, and age, all have an effect on sentencing outcomes as well. Again, as some would define it, a sentencing disparity exists when all of these legal factors are exactly the same, but we can attribute some type of sentencing difference to one of these extralegal factors. Therefore, in our own study, we need to consider both the legal factors and the extralegal factors when we're talking about sentencing disparities. So I'm going to summarize some of the literature and the findings on the effects of these extralegal variables on sentencing outcomes. And so like I just said, legally relevant variables tend to have a strong and significant effect on sentencing outcomes, but net of these factors, research has also found that race and ethnicity contribute to sentencing decisions, specifically with Black offenders receiving more punitive sanctions compared to white offenders. So Black offenders are more likely to receive a prison sentence and are often more likely than white offenders to receive a discretionary sentencing enhancement, something like adding a habitual offender enhancement. However, a less consistent racial disadvantage is found when we're looking at sentencing length decisions. There's also a growing body of research on Hispanic offenders, which is drawing similar conclusions that Hispanic offenders are more likely to be sent to prison compared to white offenders, but these differences in sentencing lengths are often small and sometimes non-significant. Importantly, these racial and ethnic differences are most pronounced when we're looking at drug cases, with Black and Hispanic offenders receiving more punitive sentences compared to white offenders. Further, there's also a body of research that looks at disparities in the application of the death penalty when considering both the race of the offender and the race of the victim. For example, Black offenders are sentenced to death and executed at disproportionately higher rates compared to white offenders. So the sentencing research also looks at disparities based on sex. And overwhelmingly, this literature suggests that female offenders are receiving more lenient sentences in the criminal justice system compared to male offenders. Specifically, male offenders are more likely to receive a prison sentence, often receive longer sentences, and are likely to receive and are less likely to receive a downward sentencing departure. Additionally, research shows a curvilinear relationship between age and sentencing outcomes. And what I mean by that is this graph I have depicted here. So younger offenders and older offenders usually have more lenient sentences, being less likely to be sent to prison, having shorter sentences. And we usually see a peak in sentencing severity for those between the ages of 21 and 27 years of age. Importantly, a lot of the recent research on sentencing outcomes assesses the combined effects of race, ethnicity, sex, and age. And this work suggests that males and Black and Hispanic males in their 20s in particular receive the harshest sentences in our criminal justice system. So academic studies not only shed light on the disparities that do exist in the criminal justice system, but they also provide a context for understanding why through theoretical explanations. So I'm briefly going to talk about one of the leading theoretical frameworks in the academic community, and that is the focal concerns framework. And so this perspective suggests that court actors make sentencing decisions based on three focal concerns: blameworthiness, the protection of the community, and practical constraints and consequences. So blameworthiness considers the culpability and the degree of responsibility attributed to the offender. So maybe considering the role of the offender in the crime, the injury caused by the offender. The protection of the community emphasizes the need to incapacitate dangerous offenders and deter potential offenders in order to protect the community. And finally, the practical constraints and consequences. This refers to judges considering the individual practical consequences of sentencing somebody, such as an offender's ability to serve time, maybe the health of that offender, a disruption to a family, whether that offender is a caretaker. And so the focal concerns framework emphasizes the importance of individual attributes in sentencing decisions. So according to this theoretical perspective, when court actors are facing uncertainty, they must rely on stereotypes about social groups to predict future offending. So court actors are making rational decisions. However, those are bounded by the available information. Therefore, disparities in the sentencing process and the reliance on extra-legal variables occurs when court actors have to rely on these stereotypes about race and sex and age to predict whether that defendant will participate in future criminal behavior. And so to quickly summarize, as we would expect, research does find that legal factors such as the offense severity and the criminal history are strong predictors of sentencing outcomes. However, the research is also suggesting that disparities do exist in sentencing as extra-legal factors such as race, sex, and age often influence sentencing decisions in similarly situated cases. And so while I've provided some theoretical perspective here today to give you some context on that, it's important to note that the Commission will not be testing theory with our own study. However, we will be focusing on the empirical findings to inform policy. Thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer.
Yes.
I appreciate the staff's preparation for moving into what we will hear from Michelle on as far as North Carolina sentencing data. We've now had this survey explanation, and we've had an academic summary. Before I turn it over to Michelle, I have reserved on our agenda time for some discussion, some reactions, questions. But I've already, and that I, in my mind and on the agenda, had saved
gender and other factors when, for example, advanced supervised release is used in higher felony cases. Thanks.
And I'm going to turn to Michelle.
Thank you for the questions. To answer your first question, I think the best answer would be we wish we could include that level of specificity about the plea arrangements, but unfortunately within the empirical data in ACES, which is the data source for the conviction data, there isn't that level of detail that's recorded to be able to tell us what specific elements of the plea were decided upon by, the attorneys versus what the court is doing. So the best we can do with looking at mode of disposition is whether a conviction was resolved by a plea or by trial. So unfortunately can't dig that much further. It's definitely something that we have talked about with AOC as they transition to their new ICMS data system. I don't know that they have planned improvements to capture more information about the plea arrangements, but it's definitely been raised to them. So if there were data, we could include it in a model to get at exactly what you're talking about. As to the second question about advanced supervised release, we'll definitely make note of that to examine. There have been so few convictions imposed since the inception of that particular sentencing option. We'll just have to sort of consider what we might be able to learn from that would be generalizable if we were to examine that. But we'll definitely make a note of that. And just for the greater good, I should have said, there were just some examples of independent variables listed on that slide. Certainly, we are going to try and take into account everything that we have available at our fingertips, and particularly related to the bail issue that has been raised. We are investigating what data might be able to speak to that in terms of what's in the ACES record as part of that sort of conviction episode, and if there's anything that might we might be able to put into the model on that particular variable. So sorry, I should have said that on the slide, that those are just some examples of independent variables, and we're definitely making note of all of the topics and variables of interest that you all have expressed today. So thank you.
Thank you, Michelle. She picked up, because Michelle is an expert at multitasking. For those of you like me that really don't lack all of that juggling capacity, in the chat, Commissioner Lee has emphasized here that the bail issue is a problem, and I'll just read it to you. And that's why the North Carolina Association of Counties Justice and Public Safety Steering Committee has a legislative goal for bail reform. So it's not just the governor, it's not just the Sheriff's Association, it's not just the legislature, it's not just the Sentencing Commission, it's also the Association of Counties. So Commissioner Lee, thank you for adding that input. And I picking up on the multitasking, for those of you that have your grid view in full focus here, it's great to see that Chief King, he's out there serving felony warrants as he's participating on this on our Commissioner Webex. He's a busy man. I'm going to try and keep us on time, Chief. So any other reactions? And yes, Representative McNeil.
Sorry, had a little trouble unmuting there. I know in the last session, the legislature did a lot with the expungements. And so I was just wondering, are we looking at anything? Because I know when you're talking about these prior records and everything like that, do we think that's going to make a big difference? Are we looking at anything to do with the new law and the expungements and how that's going to help maybe factor into what we're looking at?
Michelle, you going to react to that for me?
I can. It's something that we have talked about on staff as sort of a question of if we could examine it, and if we could, how. So I would say I don't know if that, we'll certainly make note of it to investigate to see if that could be included as part of this study. But the expunction records are, obviously super highly confidential. So I don't know if we would be able to get access to who has had an expunction, and then let me just say this. We'll try and investigate it. I don't know. It's definitely something that we have talked about, not in connection with this study, but it's a very interesting point that you raised, and we can definitely explore it more to see what might be possible.
Thank you, Representative McNeil and Michelle. So I note that we are coming close to the noon hour, and you now see why I opted to skip over the agenda item of a presentation on the governor's task force. I didn't do that lightly. We have our own Sheriff Clemens, who is on deck to present on that, and I am sorry that we asked you to prepare and present, and we don't have time today. But let me at least address that agenda item as follows, because Michelle has helped me put together a note about sort of where we are with the homework that I sent you on the survey. And the note reads the following. I want to thank all of you that did participate in the survey when I was soliciting feedback on the task force recommendations. I've got two updates. One, following the release of our survey, after you got it and did it and submitted it, the task force moved its deadline back to December the 15th. As opposed to when we sent it to you with this immediacy attached to it of December the 1st. And the second item is there is an emerging theme from your responses. And that's that those of you that either did the short list of 6 or went on to consider all those recommendations, and they were lengthy, you wanted more time. And that's understandable. And some of you, I've talked to you offline about this. You wanted more time to consider some of those ideas that were presented. I appreciate that. I acknowledge that. And for that reason, due to that deadline, it might be prudent to wait until the task force finalizes its recommendations. It was such a comprehensive list. I heard a summary, like I said, from the AG yesterday. And believe me, he boiled it down because of his limited time on their agenda to the Crime Commission to really just 4 really quick things. And I would feature among them that, decriminalizing simple possession of marijuana was sort of an attention grabber, as articulated by the AG. But they were leaning, those 4 that he featured were leaning on the policing side, as opposed to the recommendations that you were considering as comprehensive as they were. So getting them to boil them down to their final list might be better for a better use of our time before we give them feedback, which is a part of our duty as a stakeholder. So I'm thinking like the March meeting. There'll be other opportunities for the commission to weigh in as to those recommendations as they move forward. And is there any objection to my approach about that? If no objection to waiting to a later point, then I won't share the survey at this point, the survey feedback with the task force, and we'll wait for further discussion in March. So we are close on time. Hearing no objection, I will, before I invite Michelle as to whether we have time for a real brief update from Tamara. What you think? Can we do that?
You can do it in 30 seconds. Tamara, you want to unmute, and I'm going to pull this up real quick.
Yes, while Michelle's pulling up, we wanted to do, everybody's looking for something positive this year. I know I am, and wanted to update you on my most recent guide dog puppy, Quay. You'll be seeing her picture. I've had her, believe it or not, for those of you back who were commissioners in August of 2019, she came to our office as a puppy. There she is on the left, and attended her first commission meeting. I received word from Guiding Eyes. I returned her in early or mid-November, and she has been selected, which is quite an honor to become a breeder. She's still being evaluated. She has to go through a bunch of medical tests. And the picture on the right is Quay right before I took her back to Guiding Eyes, which is in New York. So wanted to thank the commissioners for your help in raising Quay. She came, that was part of her training to come to meetings. So thank you guys. It does take a commission, staff and members to raise a guide dog puppy, and hopefully Quay will be be a mom to future guide dogs. So very thrilled for Quay and very proud of her. So thank you guys.
Tamara, thank you for that update. Great positive way to conclude our meeting. Thanks to the commissioners for participating and reacting and discussing and suggesting. Your insights are invaluable. As we know, to my fellow commissioners, we benefit from the best staff in state government, the absolute best. And without further ado, I will adjourn this meeting, and other than through email communications to the modification of any other schedule, we will again convene in March. You'll hear whether that will be in person or virtual, but I want it to be as optimistic, and despite 6 counties that are currently having their courthouses closed due to COVID as we sit here today, we will do what is most risk averse as we convene, because your jobs beyond your service as a commissioner is very important. So happy holidays to everyone. And with that, we are adjourned.
Happy holidays from the staff. We appreciate all of you.
Michelle, if you'll stay on real quick. Jenny, you were working overtime. I saw you. It's not